The world thought Burkina Faso was lost. Terrorist groups controlled vast lands. Villages were abandoned and hope seemed buried under fear. But in just months, a shocking turnaround has shaken Africa. President Ibrahim Traoré's forces have reclaimed 72% of the nation's territory, striking fear into enemies and inspiring millions who had nearly given up. The sun rose over the dusty plains of Burkina Faso, but its light brought little warmth to the hearts of the people. Villages that once bustled with morning markets now stood empty, doors broken, and homes abandoned. In the northern regions, entire families had fled under the cover of night, carrying nothing but fear and a few belongings. Schools that should have been filled with the sound of children's laughter were locked, their walls crumbling as silence replaced the rhythm of learning. In the distance, the echo of gunfire was a constant reminder that life was no longer safe. The enemy had spread like a shadow across the land, claiming towns and cutting off communities. Roads that once connected neighbors were now paths of danger, where ambushes could strike at any moment. Farmers left their fields to wither, unable to harvest crops under the threat of violence. Mothers prayed each evening, unsure if their sons would return from even the simplest errands. It felt as though the heartbeat of the nation had slowed, weakened by fear. Whispers of hopelessness spread across the country. Some said Burkina Faso would never recover, that the strength of its people had been broken beyond repair. International observers predicted collapse, claiming that the land would remain in enemy hands for generations. Yet, deep in the hearts of the citizens, a silent fire remained. They remembered the days when their villages thrived, when music and laughter filled the air, when no child feared walking to school. It was this hidden strength, this quiet refusal to surrender, that would one day awaken. Though the land seemed lost, the spirit of Burkina Faso was only waiting for a leader bold enough to call it back to life. When Ibrahim Traoré first stepped forward to lead the nation, many people were uncertain. He was young, barely in his 30s, and faced an enemy that had already broken stronger governments before him. Critics inside and outside the country whispered that he would fail, that he would crumble under the pressure. But while the world doubted him, the people of Burkina Faso began to notice something different. Traoré did not sit behind palace walls or speak only from grand podiums. He walked among his people, listening to their fears, their losses, and their hopes. In dusty villages, he shook the hands of farmers who had abandoned their land. In crowded towns, he promised parents that their children would one day go back to school without fear. His words were not polished with politics. They carried the weight of truth, spoken from someone who understood the pain of his people. He called for unity, urging every citizen to stand not as victims, but as defenders of their homeland. He told the youth that the strength of the nation rested on their shoulders. He invited volunteers from across the country to join the fight, not only with weapons, but with courage and determination. This land is ours, he declared, and no force on earth will take it away if we rise together. For the first time in years, hope began to stir. Soldiers felt renewed strength, villagers found reason to resist, and ordinary people began to believe in something larger than themselves. Traoré's leadership was not about fear, it was about awakening, the pride and dignity of a nation. Slowly, the silence of despair gave way to the sound of voices ready to fight for freedom. The first counterattacks were small, almost invisible to the outside world. A village here, a road there, government forces and local volunteers striking quickly, reclaiming what had been lost. At first, the enemy laughed, believing they still held the upper hand. But then the victories began to multiply. Every week brought news of another community freed, another area taken back. What began as whispers of resistance soon grew into a roar across the nation. Traoré's strategy was different from anything before. He combined the strength of the military with the courage of ordinary citizens who refused to surrender their homes. Young men and women who had never held a rifle stood side by side with trained soldiers, guided not only by weapons, but by an unshakable belief in their land. Villages formed defense groups, farmers returned to their fields under the protection of the army, and marketplaces that had been ghost towns filled again with voices and trade. Step by step, the map of Burkina Faso began to change. Places once marked as no-go zones turned green again, symbols of safety and freedom. The enemy, who had once struck fear into the hearts of civilians, began to flee. Their strongholds collapsed one after another, and their power crumbled. As quickly as it had spread, Asterisk, for the first time in years, children could run outside without fear. Families lit fires in the night, not to keep watch, but to celebrate. Each reclaimed village became a symbol, not only of land won back, but of dignity restored. The people of Burkina Faso began to feel the weight of fear lift from their shoulders. Replaced by a newfound courage, the counterattack was no longer just a military campaign. It was the rebirth of a nation. Asterisk, with every victory, the spirit of the nation grew stronger. Villages that had once been deserted came back to life as families returned to rebuild their homes. Women carried baskets of grain through markets once again. Traders called out their prices, and children filled the air with laughter where silence had once reigned. The change was so visible that even the skeptics, those who had once said Burkina Faso could never rise again, began to believe. Asterisk, the government pushed further, and with each operation, larger parts of the country returned to safety. Refugees who had been living in camps for years began the long journeys back to their villages. Some returned to broken houses and burned fields, but they did not despair. Instead, they rebuilt with pride, brick by brick, seed by seed. For them, every stone placed and every seed planted was an act of defiance. Proof that life would not be destroyed. Asterisk, schools reopened, their doors wide for the first time in years. Teachers stood proudly before classrooms, and children, once too afraid to walk the roads, carried their books with joy. The sound of pens scratching across paper became as powerful as the sound of victory on a battlefield. Burkina Faso was not only reclaiming land, it was reclaiming its future. Asterisk, and then came the moment that changed everything. Reports confirmed that the government now controlled more than half of the national territory. What had seemed impossible only months before was now reality across the nation. People celebrated not just a military victory, but a turning point. In their history, they realized that freedom was not a dream. It was happening before their very eyes. Asterisk, the announcement shook the world. 72% of Burkina Faso's territory was back under government control. For the people, it was more than a statistic. It was proof that their struggle had meaning. Streets filled with celebrations, drums echoed across villages, and flags waved proudly in the wind. For the first time in years, the people walked, with their heads held high, no longer prisoners of fear, but citizens of a nation reborn. Asterisk, the victories had not come easily. Families had sacrificed, soldiers had fallen, and ordinary citizens had risked their lives to defend their homes. But every sacrifice stitched together the fabric of unity that now held the nation strong. Ibrahim Traoré's promise had not been empty words. It had become reality. His leadership had turned despair into hope, and fear into courage. Asterisk, across the countryside, fields bloomed again with harvests, a symbol that life had returned to the soil. In the cities, schools overflowed with students eager to learn, their laughter carrying a message to the world. Burkina Faso's future belonged to its children, not its enemies. Even the smallest villages now carried the rhythm of life, music, markets, and prayers for peace. Asterisk, yet the people knew the struggle was not over. The remaining land still needed to be reclaimed, and challenges would continue to test their strength. But there was no doubt anymore. The nation that the world once thought was broken had proven itself unbreakable. United by resilience, lifted by courage, and guided by a leader who refused to surrender, Burkina Faso was no longer standing on the edge of collapse. It was standing on the path of victory. Asterisk, a new chapter had begun, and this time, it was written by the people themselves. Asterisk, if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, comment, and share to spread the message of resilience. Asterisk, subscribe to Faso Histories for more inspiring stories that keep history alive.